So John Scott is one of the first palliative care MDs in Canada. He assisted Dr. Beaumont in 1975 in developing Canada's first palliative care program at McGill University. And he also was one of the founding members of the Canadian Society of Palliative Care Physicians. You can read more on him in the bio. I'm going to skip that for time. And I found from Margaret that he is married and has a bunch of kids, and we're not sure how many, so maybe he'll enlighten us on that. He has 8, and he took a hiatus from medicine to be a sheep farmer and be with his family. And I remember reading a newspaper article about him when I was in medical school, which is probably why I didn't get to have you as a preceptor when I was doing my palliative care elective in medical school. According to Margaret, John is a gentle, encouraging person with a humility of spirit. Margaret gave me a story, which I hadn't heard before, but she first heard John Scott speak in Halifax, and this basically, his participation in an afternoon conference on palliative care inspired her to become a palliative care physician. She had just moved to Halifax with Robin, for Robin to do his ophthalmology residency, and his program director came to their house and asked her what she was going to do now, and invited her to come to the conference. And when she went, she had her aha moment, and she knew what she was going to be when she grew up after that. So Margaret is married to Robin, and they're highly involved in CMDS. She is also a palliative care physician in Vancouver. They have 2 adult children who are married, and Myra is here, and her husband John, and they've been participating in the band. And Margaret has been a great mentor to me, and I'm really thankful that I can call on her for advice when I do palliative care, and she has encouraged me spiritually many a time, and I'm just really thankful for her mentorship. And it's a demonstration that she's been mentored by Dr. John Scott, and she's been a mentor to me, and all of us are mentors in various capacities at various times in our lives. So the students will not stop. The students will move into that role, or they can do that for the younger or the more junior students as well. So let me pray for you too, and then we'll let you up here. Dear God and Father in heaven, Lord, you are great and greatly to be praised. Thank you that we could worship you this morning. I pray that you would be with John and Margaret now as they introduce their topic, and give them wisdom and quietness of heart as they speak to us, and help us, Lord, to learn what you'd have us to learn. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Okay, so this is our prayer this morning. Eternal God, light of the minds that know you, the joy of the hearts that love you, the strength of the wills that serve you, grant us so to know you that we may truly love you, and so to love you that we may truly serve you, whose service is perfect freedom, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Now, here's the objectives of what we want to do today. So I hope you brought your lunch. John's going to work on the first 2, and I'm going to work on the others. And part of what we're doing here is from a question that our colleague Serge Dano from Montreal posed at one of our congresses. He says, is support for euthanasia and assisted suicide growing because we are not teaching our learners and learning ourselves how to be radically present? And in French, that's accompagner. It really means to be there with those who are suffering in ways that are meaningful and safe. So here's John's disclosure slide, the best that I could figure it out for what he is. And then here's his financial disclosure slide. So John is so wonderfully creative that most of the things he's going to share with you have beautiful images. And so that I will leave him to do that with you. There you go, John.
Thank you, Margaret. I did want to, before we started talking about some practical things about patient care, I did want to begin with a reflection on the mystery of Gethsemane, because I think that not only that biblical framework is so important for us at the bedside, in our having a framework for caring for those at the end of life, but also is a framework for dealing with the larger societal issues of the pressures that we've been discussing throughout this conference. And certainly the first time I saw the application of the story, Watch With Me from the Garden, to the care of the terminally ill was back in 1975 when I spent 5 weeks at St. Christopher's Hospice in London. At that time, St. Christopher's had only been open 7 years, and it was Dame Cicely Saunders, at the time not a dame, just Dr. Saunders, was already demonstrating the story of Gethsemane in her work. I was introduced at that time to an essay that she had written called Watch With Me 10 years earlier in 1965, describing how this work, this was before St. Christopher's had been created, but she had a vision, a woman with a deep Christian vocation. And then I also saw it demonstrated at the bedside, where in this case, it was a nurse assigned. So someone who was close to death, if it seemed that we could predict it was hours and no family was present, there was always a staff member or a volunteer who was assigned to sit at the bedside. Watch with me. In our caring for our patients, I believe we become connected to Jesus, especially Jesus in the garden. Jesus is our patient. Jesus is not just the patient at the very last hours, but is also, and I think it's very important that Gethsemane is talking about the earlier point, the point of diagnosis, the point of prognosis, where patients with chronic illness, where addictions and mental health problems and many other stressors are happening, and they can't imagine being able to go through with this. It's a holy place. Jesus is both the patient and the physician, and this wonderful blend of the two. He is the suffering one, the very meaning of patient, and he is also the one who is watching over them. Another image from Michael O'Brien of Christ before the Sanhedrin. Execution sanctioned by not one but two legal systems. Authorized, legalized, assisted death. Certainly the story reminds us of where we are in Canada. We should not be unfamiliar with a society that tries to sanction what is evil. Watch with me. Let that mystery of the suffering and death of our Lord inform our action and our prayer. Christian physicians in Canada in this year, in these next 6 months, facing all that we've discussed, are like disciples in the garden. And one of the things that in my reflection and preparation for this, I kept seeing all the characters of the disciples and thinking, yeah, we're all of those. That's exactly where we're at. One of the things is we're saying, I don't understand, Lord. How did this happen? How did it happen so quickly? What is happening? And what's going to happen? And the sense of confusion. We don't get it. We don't understand. Just like the disciples, what? Why would this be happening? Why would Jesus be going to the cross? I think we see the disciples falling asleep in many ways, distracted, but in other ways exhausted by sorrow, as the Luke version of the story tells us. And also afraid, some running away naked, some denying, a variety of ways of trying to cope with their fears, discouragement, helplessness, and some anger. And I think the cutting off of the ear of the high priest's servant is a reminder and a warning to us that in our work in advocacy, we have to be careful not to become angry and use ridicule and contempt for those who are our enemies in this particular fight. We need to show love, even as our Lord did in that story, healing and love. So, in terms of what the work of watching with me is all about, I mean, certainly it means prayer. It means presence, being there, accompaniment. It means staying awake, paying attention. But it also means guarding, protecting, warning, so that advocacy side as well as the bedside part of that story applies to what we're being called to. I do think that euthanasia battle is a Gethsemane battle, because it isn't the physical suffering of our patients that's really the core of this issue. It is the spiritual and psychological anguish, and that is the pain of Gethsemane. It's not our work, but the Lord's, and that's the other part of what Watch With Me is about. It is definitely, we need to stand up, but it really isn't our work. And that reminder, he is inviting us to come with him as he watches over those we have been given. So, one of the things I wanted to do is just to look back on some of the origins of our work in the modern times. Ressourcement, to go back to the springs of water from which we came. And so, certainly for me personally, but I think for all of the work that Christian physicians do around the world in care for those who are close to death, we look to Dame Cicely Saunders of England as a huge source of inspiration. She had a very clear calling from God from the late 40s, and that worked its way out gradually until she created St. Christopher's in 1967. And the 1960s were a time of upheaval, and I was thinking of our discussion last night about Maelstrom and what's happening in our society. To some extent, those of us who were in the 60s, it seemed a little bit like that then too. Everything was falling apart. People were turning away from God in large numbers. People were rebelling against any kind of authority, and it was scary. We didn't know where it was going to be going. And yet in that time, there was a huge outpouring of the Holy Spirit in a number of areas, including the creation of the modern hospice movement. So we have to remember that in terms of what might be happening right now. There may well be very exciting new things that are just about to happen. Dame Cicely would quickly tell us that she's just following in the steps of many others who have formed and followed the Lord into the garden. The hospices for pilgrims and those who were dying that were in the monastic orders. We could go through the whole of Christian healthcare, but certainly closer to our time in the 19th century, early 20th century, there was another flurry of activity in the original hospices that were the models for Dame Cicely, as well as homes for the incurables and other types of works from many churches around the world. But there was something special and intentional about the work of St. Christopher's in London. And I think one of the things that Dame Cicely was wanting to say with even the architecture was this was a place of light, lots of windows. People are afraid. And having those windows was a way of saying, be not afraid. And there was also attention to detail. The architect was told specifically the windows had to have a sill that was low enough so that everyone in bed could see out the window. The things that we don't think of when we're the caregiver, we're not in bed, we don't see that. I mean, amazing attention to little details at St. Christopher's. I remember being with the matron, the director of nursing, and suddenly a buzzer went off, and she excused herself and went out of the room quickly. She would rush down to the ambulance entrance of the hospital, of the hospice, and she made sure that she told everyone that don't open the doors of the ambulance, I'm the one who opens them. So she'd open up and she'd walk right into the ambulance and she would say, hello, Mrs. Smith, welcome to St. Christopher's. And that was the most important. She might be meeting the budget committee, anything. That would take precedence over anything else she did. And the patient would be put into the bed, not into a stretcher, but into the bed. They had made the elevator at that spot large enough for their large beds. It would be, in those days, it was safe to use hot water bottles. So hot water bottles, 2 of them, plus a big fluffy Afghan, those kind of signs of welcome, and a little flowers and a little card at the bedside saying, welcome, Mrs. Smith. Those little actions that indicate that an institution and a lot of individuals have made a commitment to something that's deep. Certainly it was a Christian foundation. This was one of the paintings on the wall of the resurrection. The more important part of that Christian foundation, however, was Christian physicians. And again, just the main thing I'm wanting to say is that this work was started by Christian physicians. There were 4 key physicians at St. Christopher's: Dame Cicely, Mary Baines, Tom West, and Therese Vanier. 3 Protestants, 1 Catholic. Therese Vanier, daughter of our late Governor General, Georges Vanier. When he was High Commissioner to London, his daughter was at a pivotal point, and she became a physician, a hematologist, worked with her brother a lot in the care of adult handicapped in the L'Arche movement, but she herself began to do more and more work with St. Christopher's and the care of the terminally ill. Certainly, St. Christopher's commitment to pain control. This is a painting that a patient did of their pain, the complexity of pain, the total pain that we might be talking about a little later. And there was a scientific and compassionate response to that. Highly rigorous attempt to change how we were dealing with pain, which has spread throughout the world. A lot of the things we just take for granted now and don't know came from the hospice palliative care movement. How we use subcutaneous, how we give Q4H dosing for main opioids. That was not known in 1975. It was spurned in 1975. Huge advances. And there was community. There was this a sense of being together in this. And I think this particular model was, Dr. Mount and then Dr. Jamian and I were both went over and spent some time there and were truly excited by what we saw. I could go into some depth. I think there are actually some very important things that in translating that original hospice idea into a Canadian hospital, a secular hospital, a number of things happened. Some of them very good and some of them not so good. But I think it needed to happen in order for it to spread internationally quickly. And so the international model is actually a Canadian model. But again, what is often not emphasized, and I don't do it in most speeches, is that it was started by Christian physicians. Again, 4 Christian physicians, who all were very intentional about why they were doing this work. Oh, yes, exactly. You're absolutely right, especially the one, so the young guy up at the top there is Bal Mount, and beside him is Ken McKinnon, who later was very pivotal in changing the whole scope of palliative care in Nova Scotia. He was a urologist along with Bal. He was Bal's mentor and boss at this time. He was the chief of staff of the hospital, and he was very pivotal. You always need champions who will actually give the space and give the money and give the support. And he, an amazing man. And Ina Cummings is the one in the middle, and this young guy at the bottom there is actually someone that you see right now. It's hard to believe, but certainly we have seen a hijacking of the language of palliative care. The issue of whether or not we're going to actually see the whole movement of palliative care hijacked by those who would want to go in the direction of euthanasia is yet to be seen. At the moment, I would say that we are holding fast as a group of physicians in palliative care, but just 2 weeks ago in the city, we had the annual meeting for the Canadian Society of Palliative Care Physicians, and we are saying this is not palliative care. Euthanasia, assisted suicide, if society wants that, that's not us. We're not going to be involved. In the present environment, things are changing, though, and we have to be ready to say we're not stuck on one word, one name, one label, and if at any time palliative care is totally hijacked by something that is against the Lord's will, then we'll find another way of doing our work with different labels. But for now, I really still think as a group we should be trying to support and affirm that approach. I was wanting to go back for a minute just to the little photograph there of myself, because one of the things about this conference is the title, Love One Another, and loving our patients. That photograph was taken in 1975 by Bal, who was Bal at that time was a full-time urologist, but he was the visionary, and he was always taking photographs, and I forgot about the fact that he'd taken photographs until later that year. Well, it was 1976, the first national conference, a screen twice as big as that. Suddenly, I was sitting there, and my photograph goes up, and I remember distinctly feeling so embarrassed. I looked so young and so vulnerable and so unprofessional, and it caught me at it was a very real moment with this patient, and somehow this wasn't the image I wanted for myself. And of course, I've come to love that photograph because it's talking not only about my touching her, but she's touching me. And that interplay, that divine reversal that goes on of where we think we're the ones giving, and suddenly we realize, aha, we're here because we need this. We need to be loved. And obviously that in teaching that to other people, there has to be a line. You can't be going there to meet your needs on a daily basis, but it is to be able to be vulnerable is so critical. I meet so many physicians who are so afraid to get a little closer, and they rob themselves of the most important part of medicine. The actual flow of energy, of love that can come both ways is what keeps us going. It certainly keeps me going. And we certainly not only love our patients, but we also are called to love our colleagues, even the colleagues who are obviously out of denial of death and denial of all that is good, are running out of the room, are ordering all kinds of tests, running out of the room, don't have the conversations. We see a lot of poor care, and we can get so frustrated with our colleagues and how to continue to show love as well as challenge. and our society. How do we love our culture? That is, this is a pretty nice photo of our culture. A lot of, I had some pretty ugly stuff, but I'm partly saying by that, they're just wanting to plug their ears and go, la, 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 la. Let me just pretend this is not happening. And yes, we need to do a serious analysis of how ugly some of what we see is going on. But I think the worry of that is the danger for us as Christians is that we can go to a nasty place. We can go to a judgmental, self-righteous place, and that will get us nowhere. It will be bad for us as well as bad for those who we're talking to. So sometimes for me, I really do want to frame it in ways that help me have empathy for my culture, and that is to see the fear behind so much of what we see. It comes across so bitter and hard, and they're wanting to get rid of our rights, etc. But underneath, there's raw fear. The reason people are willing to jump off a cliff in euthanasia is because they feel there's some horrible monster that's going to come after them. And it's so horrible for them to think they hear that monster coming for them, that they are willing to throw themselves off a cliff. I think it's that level of fear, both at an individual and a societal level, that we need to think about and pray about and wonder how we can minister to that. Be not afraid. The other thing that in loving one another, this conference is fantastic. I just am, and I'm also so excited about having the two streams of Christendom that I have been part of to be together. And that is so, darn it, I'm getting emotional. So I think, and I think it's prophetic. I think it's very important what we're doing. And showing love and respect for one another, I'm very, very honored by the being part of this. So thank you. See, I can't say all that I was going to say, but I did at least get through that part. As far as communication is concerned, the issues of how we deal with it. This woman was early in my career, as you can see from the telephone on the side. And this isn't a museum, this is actually a hospital. And the reason we often give those early cases that were pivotal in changing our mind. She was a woman who wanted to die. She wanted to suicide. She wanted to get out of what she considered to be an insoluble set of problems, social ones, but also a metastatic breast cancer in an era that there were far fewer options than today. And she had been a model in New York City. So the changes in her body were totally unacceptable to her. She was grieving, anguishing about this illness and what it was doing. And there was really, she felt no hope. And through good psychiatric care, through good symptom control of the physical symptoms she had, and a network of new friends and supportive healthcare professionals, she came through that. And really, her final weeks of life, she considered to be the most fulfilling and wonderful of her entire life. And that story is repeated in many of our minds and hearts here. She actually wanted this photograph to be taken. She wanted me to use it to teach medical students and others about what it was like for her and why it was so important to do this kind of work. The work of Belmont and others more recently, just analyzing those who are calling things suffering or anguish. This isn't about physical pain. It's about disconnection, about a crisis of meaning, about not being able to be in the present, mostly preoccupied with future fears, a sense of victimization, and a very serious or high level of need for control. Communication, listening, not talking, sometimes talking, but listening deeply first. Most of us listen and very quickly are starting to formulate what we're going to say in response instead of just listening. And that's partly, you need to be willing to be awkward if you're going to just listen, because you know that if you haven't prepared the next thing you're going to say, it might come across that you're awkward and you're incompetent. And so certainly for most of us, we begin to sort of think, what's the next part of this conversation? We don't really deeply listen. I certainly need this preached at me as well. Touch. This guy is not ready for a touch yet. I don't think you would agree. And yet, Ina is putting her hand out to be seen. She's moving in the direction. She's offering a touch in a very subtle way. She's close. She's lower than the patient, so she's not hovering over. There's all kinds of ways that we need to communicate other than our words. So it's not easy. There's no easy way to tell you this, so I'm sending you to someone who can. Well, that's not really what we need. That sense of awkwardness, of feeling we're not in control, it's one of the ways that we actually identify with our patients. We have to feel a little bit awkward. I'll often, medical students will say, well, what do I say? I'm worried about what to say. Well, that's good. It's good to be worried about what you say. The day you don't worry about what you're going to say is the day to get out of that kind of work. Because I literally, 40 years later, when I'm with a patient, there's a part of me that thinks, I'm a fraud. I don't know what to do right now. I don't know what to say. I've been doing this for so long, and then I think, yes, that's wonderful, actually, that every encounter is unique. And that uniqueness, that freshness needs to be maintained. How many minutes? 1 minute? Yeah, right. I'm going to skip. Some of this will be in, I think Margaret was going to give us some, I'm going to give you a few of these questions, things you might say at the bedside that would open up a conversation. What do you hope to contribute in the time you have remaining? What helps you most to stand strong against the challenges of this illness? What should I know about you that lies beyond your illness? Can you imagine that others who witness how you cope with this illness might describe you as a courageous person? What does God hope you will do with your life in the days to come? Do you sense that God sees meaning in your suffering? Each of us will have a different vocabulary. Sometimes it's quite clear that you can't move into some of these questions, but having a bank of questions is important. And I think I think Margaret will also be talking about the encounter with patients who are asking us about death. And maybe I'll end with that issue, that the grave danger in all of this discussion about conscience rights and euthanasia is that we will be afraid to enter deeply into discussions about death, the meaning of death, with our patients. We must not avoid that. These patients need a place to lament. It was the concept of lamentation was one that I feel God gave me as wow. It's not. I didn't create the idea, but the application of the idea of lamentation to what I see at the bedside. And to me, it's very important that we allow the lament of our patients to be expressed. It's part of our therapy. They need to be able to talk freely, openly, so we don't go rushing in to say, oh, I just want you to know that I'm a Christian physician and I don't do any of this, Shutting it down, it's like someone starts to have a little tear and someone thrusts a Kleenex box right in their face. Depending on the moment, that's a signal of, why don't you stop crying? I mean, it's subtle. Having a Kleenex box close by is good. So again, in the conversations about death, you must leave it open. Let them talk about this. There may come a time, probably in most cases, it'll never need to be said, what your beliefs about this is. You're allowing that conversation to come. Margaret, it's a delight to be doing this with Margaret. It's
a lot of fun.
It is.
Yeah.
I'll
So
have to get you down.
I'll just scoot my way through here. This is such a cool picture. Wait a minute. Oh, what happened? Did it come undone? Yes, it did. Came unplugged. Hold on. All was the way. We come back. This is such a lovely picture because the next slide shows you what else this gentleman had. This is one of John's patients who had 2 weeks before he died, John, another little baby. And there's a real lament for you. I have to okay, I'm a little bit. Okay, so these are some of John's beautiful images that I'm just going to scroll through here. Our lovely friend Harvey Chachinoff with his dignity therapy. Michael O'Brien. Okay, here's my disclosure slide. I also am going to give you my email address at the end of this so that you will be able to send me an email and I will send you a PDF of the slides without most of the images though, because some of those are copyright, so we won't send those out. But at least the information, because I am going to give you a lot of information. Now, I'm not sure what happened to this one slide I had. I don't know where it went. Anyway, I had a slide that had a picture of a seatbelt being buckled because that's the way you ought to feel right now. Put on your seatbelts because I have a huge amount of information that's going to come at you. I'm actually going to skip a bunch of slides. I'm just going to show you that they're there so that you will be able to write to me and I will send it to you. I know this is really terrible pedagogy, that you're supposed to put one or two things on a slide and be done with it and then send people home with that, but the information is just not out there in ways that's accessible for our colleagues. The media are horrible at it, so I'm giving you a little primer here and you can take it home and digest it. So you're going to drink out of a fire hydrant for a little while. The first part that I've been assigned to do is to talk about team building. And Bal Mount was fond of saying, you work on a team, show me your scars. And that is very true. There's nothing like a team to be able to wound you at times. But on the other hand, I really like this Charlie Brown cartoon where he says, I dropped the fly ball and we lose the championship. I could have been the hero. Instead, I'm a goat. The other team is carrying their manager home on their shoulders. Heroes ride, goats walk. And what I really like about palliative care is that nobody has to be the hero or the goat, that we all work together, and that if something isn't going just particularly well, there's not this big blame game and finger pointing. We sit down together and say, well, that didn't work. What do we try next? And who's on this team? Well, first and foremost, it's the patients and their families, and our volunteers, nurses and care aides, social work, physio, OT, pharmacists, dietitians, chaplains, art and music therapy, administrators and fundraisers, physicians, including family docs and specialists, and you can use your imagination to add people to that. I have a couple of really important team members. These are not the actual pictures, but everybody has something to contribute. When I worked in Halifax, our very best pain sleuth was Loretta, who was our cleaning lady. And she would be in the rooms. We'd just done rounds, and she'd come down the hallway. She was about this tall, and she'd say, I think Mrs. Smith needs a breakthrough. And I said, we were just in there. And she was fine. She said, yeah, but I was vacuuming. And she said, she looked really like she was in pain. And I said, well, why didn't you tell him? Well, I didn't want to disappoint the doctors, Mrs. Smith would say. So Loretta, our spy, would come down and say she needs a breakthrough. So pay attention to those things. The other picture of the present being wrapped was a very moving thing that I experienced also in Halifax. We had a woman who was a very famous kind of opera diva who was one of our volunteers who came in. And we had a cart that had donated gifts that people would put on there. And if one of our patients needed to give a gift for Christmas or a birthday, they could choose something off the cart and they could wrap it themselves, or one of our volunteers would wrap it. And I was about to go into this room to see the patient when I overheard this heated exchange. And the volunteer, the opera singer, was wrapping this present for the woman. And the woman just blew up at her. And she said, don't you know anything? You never wrap a present by pushing the top paper down first. You push the sides in first. And I thought, oh my gosh, how dare she talk to my volunteer like that? You know, I'm a feisty little person, and I just, don't you do that. But what the opera singer realized was this woman who was the patient was an artist, a visual artist, and she was left-handed, and she had had a total resection of her left upper quadrant, and she couldn't do it herself. And it was just the overflowing of the frustration of not being able to be the artist that she was, that another artist's heart understood. And so what the diva said was, in diva style, right? Not at all. I'm really sorry. She undid it. Is this the way you wanted me to do it? I started to cry. I couldn't even go into the room. I felt so chastened by this woman's selfless love. And I think that that's what the logos on our Canadian Federation and CMDS show us, that it's the cross and it's the towel and the basin. And that's the kind of team members we should be. Okay, so some good advice from seasoned team members. Listen actively with understanding and compassion. Believe the best about your fellow team members and their motivation. Put the best spin on it that you can. Keep your eyes, ears, and heart open and your mouth shut. Be sure your words are tender and sweet. You never know when you might have to eat them. Okay, so this is where the seatbelt comes in, okay? Buckle up. So what are we going to do when we're talking about advocates and educators? So these are the kind of objectives that we have. We need to educate ourselves first. Learning to be comfortable with some uncertainty. This is a really important thing in palliative care and actually in all of medicine, to actually be honest that we don't know. Having a proper balance of humility and confidence, and be clear about our own theology of suffering. You can really mess people up if you think that the whole reason that they're there is because they sinned or somebody sinned. So remember the story of the man born blind in John, where Jesus said, he's not suffering because of anybody's sin. So if you think that this is all because this person just hasn't repented, you don't belong in our profession. Sometimes that is true, but not always. Okay, so there's some things that we can do even if you don't have special palliative care training. And you can know the natural history of common diseases. So what complications might arise, and be able to translate some of these for families and patients so they're not taken by surprise. We can give what I call anticipatory care. We can care for them ahead of time so that we can say, this is what might be coming, and these are some of the things that you can try. You can have special instructions. You can have handouts or web resources. Send them places. The Canadian Virtual Hospice is a really wonderful place that families can get some real help there. You can also do, when they come to you, should I do this, doctor? Do things like, what does effective mean? I had a patient one time who took a treatment as he was at pancreatic cancer, and he took a treatment that made him vomit violently for 4 weeks because he'd been told that it had a 20% chance of being effective. So what do you think effective meant to him? That meant he would be cured. Effective to the investigators meant that he would have a chance of living 6 weeks longer. So he had a 20% chance of living 6 weeks longer, and he threw up for a month. So what does effective really mean? We need to be clear about that. And the DNR and the MOST, these things are really kind of controversial, especially in places where the person is not actively dying. But in a real palliative setting, it can be helpful to have someone they trust to discuss these things with, and to have some idea about how effective CPR is in a palliative patient. If you have a patient whose ribs are full of cancer, how many chest compressions can you do? You just can't. We need to be thinking realistically and realizing that patients, all they see of CPR is that somebody's walking down the street, has a heart attack, you pump them 3 times, and they walk off and go run a marathon. So we have to be understanding about where they're coming from this and be gentle. Also having a reasonable idea about advanced care planning. And I actually think it's better to have someone with whom you speak that you trust rather than any kind of advanced directive, because you can never figure out all the little nuances of things. But talk to the person. And the one really important message is make sure that whoever is giving the instructions leaves room for flexibility. Doesn't just say, well, I really want to die at home. Make sure that happens, honey. And then something comes up so that the person has to be cared for in a facility because they're unable to care for the person at home, and the person who was entrusted with that mourns for the rest of his or her life that they couldn't fulfill these final wishes. So leave room for flexibility. I trust you, dear, to do what's best for me. This is a big plea to you family doctors out there. Seriously consider visiting patients at home when they can no longer come to your office. There's not many that you'll have in a year who are palliative. And you are the hands and feet of Christ when you do this. I visit people at home, that's my job. It's so delightful. You get to be part of their world. If you're kind of a nosy person like I am, you get to find out all these things about them and see them in their native habitat. It's fantastic. The trophies they have on their walls, and the singing bass, and the picture that they had taken with a tiger, a real tiger, like, oh my gosh, all these things that are happening, and it gives you a place of connection with them. That's the fun part about being a doctor. I got in trouble in medical school because I was always asking these tangential questions, which is why I love palliative care, because you're supposed to ask them. It's not that hard. I had a resident one time when I was doing some opiate conversion. She looked at me, a surgical resident. She said, "You get paid to do this?" And I said, "Well, you had to call me, didn't you?" Anyway, I have to tell you, though, that I'm not dumping on surgeons, because the surgeons were the ones that gave us the 6 beds in Halifax to start our unit. We got no beds from medicine, 1 from urology and 5 from general surgery. That's how we got our unit started. And they referred to us way sooner than the medical people. So it's not complicated. There's lots of ways to get basic proficiency. There's learning modules you can do at home, courses, all these kinds of things. I'm just going to run through. These are the things that at UBC we teach as basic proficiencies for our medical students before they graduate, at least in the old curriculum. Who knows what's coming? But anyway, if you don't know these things and you're a family doctor, you need to know these things, because it's not really super hard. So how to prescribe opiates and adjuvant pain medications properly, dealing with side effects, managing constipation, dispelling opiate myths to reassure patients and families, basic management of nausea and vomiting, dyspnea, neuropathic pain, mouth care, psychosocial, family support, and spiritual issues. Also understanding the concept of total pain, that pain involves not just the physical, but the spiritual, the social, the psychological, and actually another aspect that Dr. Saunders didn't put in there is the bureaucratic part of it, where you have to sit around and go to appointments and do all of those things. Opiate rotation, switching opiates back and forth when metabolites build up, appropriate nutrition and hydration, the usefulness of methadone as an adjuvant and a pain medication, and prognostication with humility, not saying, well, you've got 6 months to live. Well, that is, they're either mad at you because the person died early, or they're sitting there waiting for the other shoe to drop if they haven't died yet. So learn the little trick of saying, well, I think it's probably days rather than weeks, or weeks rather than months, or months rather than years, and that gives you a lot more flexibility. And I'll tell you, the longer I do this work, the less I prognosticate, because people always surprise you. So the idea of appropriate nutrition and hydration, there's a difference between just a debility alone, like someone who's just had a stroke, and the very end of life. And the intent that we have really matters. If we are, if we are not giving someone food or fluids because we want them to be dead, that's intent to kill. If, however, it's someone at the very end of life who doesn't have enough albumin in their blood to keep the water in their bloodstream, and it's all going to go into their lungs anyway, then it's a comfort reason why we're withholding fluid in the last dying hours. And I have 2 patients that I can contrast. One was a man who lived by himself and nobody was caring for him, and he showed up at our emergency room in Halifax, and all he really needed was some water because he had just gotten very dehydrated. He was like one of those little animals that comes in the capsule and you add water and they kind of come to life. But he had family members arrive from New Brunswick who had not taken care of him at all, and they said, oh, he's lived a good long life. Don't be too aggressive. Guess whose names were on the will? But we also have families pushing for IVs at the very last moment when it's going to make the patient less comfortable simply because they're frightened. So we need to be able to navigate that. This is what John was talking about as well. Learn to respond to requests for hastened death with skill and compassion. Just simply saying, I don't get involved with that, sends these folks to people who will grant the request. It's so much easier just to write the prescription or to send them off. And asking these questions about what's behind the request and what are the patient and family circumstances. And could this patient just be depressed? So this is Bal Mount, whom we've been talking about. He's on his 3rd cancer, but he says, whatever my situation is now or may become, I cannot imagine arguing that the vulnerability of countless others is trumped by my challenging circumstances. And he wrote a letter to the Supreme Court of Canada that's going to be published, but if I had time, I'd read you all 3 pages, but it was in response to what do we do with these people who are really suffering? And one of the paragraphs is, he says, facing persistent suffering, we would question, for the 100th time, the patient's sources of meaning. We would start over. We would review every aspect of his or her anguish and total pain, the complexity of the needs, the care we are providing. We would yet again search for enhanced effectiveness in the face of physical, psychosocial, existential, and spiritual distress. So then he says you'd ask a colleague. It's never giving up. Watch with me is what he's saying, not just simply send me along. And one of the things he says is you go to the person and you say, Joe or Helen, what's the hardest thing for you right now? What's the hardest thing for you right now? Okay, so I'm going to skip this because you have heard plenty of this stuff, what it is, what it isn't, the Carter decision, some of these things that are there. Okay, realizing that the decision actually says that we're equating the need for help with indignity, that assumes that only purely independent people are worthy of continuance. So it's not whose life is this, but what life will we support as a people and what deaths will we encourage through our programs. And thanks to Dr. Tom Koch for this. I'm giving you his website at the end. Last summer at the ICMDA, John Wyatt said, what compassion of these practices is really saying is, I care about you so much that I'm willing to kill you or to provide the means for you to kill yourself. And people actually who are on the other side of this, our colleagues, actually agree with that statement. So there's no such thing as a death that only affects the person who died. We know that. This is really important to those of us in palliative care. Those of us who started remember the days when everybody thought we were like Dr. Kevorkian and called us Dr. Death, and people wouldn't refer to us, physicians, and patients refused to see us because they thought we were going to kill them. And this leads to more people in pain. So I think we have that message that because people will be afraid to see us, more people will suffer than the few little people who are just so terrified that they want to make an end of it. So if it is only for this tiny few, there's a much greater group of people who are vulnerable to having a lot more suffering. And we've already talked about the erosion of trust in patient relationship. John was talking about the patients needing a place to lament. Well, how much are you going to actually really lament and say some of those things, like I wish I were dead, if the doctor actually could do it? It's safe if the doctor's not going to do it, to say that. It's not safe if they are. So they already feel like they need to justify themselves to continue to live. Now they have to do it financially and other reasons too. Excellent work by folks in the disability rights group. This is Marilyn Golden. This article there's a link to it on the CMDS website from the June 2012 issue of Focus that I did. We already talked about, she said, have we gotten to the point that we will abet suicides because people need help using the toilet? The reason that people ask for this is loss of autonomy, loss of ability to engage in activities that make life enjoyable, all these kinds of things. Being a burden to their families. And she said, many of the disability rights folks will say to you, the choice between living without support and death is not really a choice. It's a false choice. And so it's fictional freedom and phony autonomy. So those of you who've probably listened in the media too have been hearing that everything's hunky-dory in Oregon. Well, it's not. They say that there's no reported problems because they don't report, period. So these are some of the things that happen in Oregon. Non-compliance isn't monitored. So the stuff that's in red there is from the Oregon Public Health Department's own words. So we cannot detect or collect data on issues of non-compliance with any accuracy. There's no investigation of abuse. It says that they don't have any authority to investigate individual death with dignity cases. Good faith is the only standard. You actually are more at risk if you treat a person than if you provide the prescription, because there's no standard. If you give the wrong prescription or something, doesn't matter. As long as you acted in good faith, that's the only standard you have to meet. The death certificate, there's a requirement, despite the fact that they say you can't, the law itself says you can't deny somebody the insurance because of using this, the doctor's required to lie on the death certificate. So Brittany Maynard, when she died in November, it was written on her death certificate that she died of a brain tumor, when the whole world knows she took the drugs. The underlying data are destroyed annually, and there's no requirement for a psychological assessment, and the person who fills out the paperwork is the doctor who did it. So Margaret Dorr is an elder law specialist in Washington State, where they have an identical law to the Oregon law. And here's some of the things that they don't tell you on the CBC. That an heir who will benefit from the patient's death can help the patient sign up and even speak for the patient. That once the lethal dose is issued from the pharmacy, there's no oversight. The death isn't required to be witnessed by a dispassionate person, and in fact, if the person dies of the underlying illness, the lethal dose is just out there in the community. It's never recalled. The self-administer can actually mean somebody putting it in the patient's mouth or into a feeding tube, and by signing the form, if you die suddenly, no questions are asked. If you go home and it's your nephew that's going to stand to inherit some money is taking care of you, and people say, oh, they just want to have it for insurance. Well, you say you'd like to send some money to Nepal, maybe you'd like to send $2,000 to Nepal, and he decides he doesn't want you to do that. He can take care of it right that night. Amy Hasbrook is a friend of mine. She is with the Toujours Vivant in Quebec, and she is visually impaired, but she had her sister-in-law draw this cartoon. She wrote a great article. She said, if 9 out of 10 suicide attempts are a cry for help, why is it that people want to make sure that those of us with disabilities get it right the first time? What about our right to cry for help? And she has this suicide prevention program with steps going up to the front door and a wheelchair ramp up the side to the assisted suicide clinic. These excellent articles by Carol Gill about disability, and no, we don't think our doctors are out to get us. They are just phenomenal articles, and I can actually have the PDFs of them I can send to you. One of the points she makes in there is it's interesting how the media are all over it when a disabled person wants to kill himself or herself. Where are they when a disabled person wants to have a clean place to live or a job? So this is our dear little friend, Ross Harding, Sheila and Terry's son, and he had Menkes disease, all sorts of things. He was zany, witty, wonderful, and very insightful. And Ross, the philosopher, in the context of the Latimer case at 8 or 9 years old, said, "You know, Mom, if I get sick again, you don't have to kill me. I can take it." And then later he said, he figured it out. He says, "You know, Mom, I figured it out." He said, "None of us gets made quite right until we get to heaven. I just got made wrong differently than most people." So wholeness is an eschatological concept, my friends. Okay, this is just showing that depression is a big thing, 20% in Oregon. Harvey Chachinoff showed that the people who had a pervasive desire to die, 59% of them were depressed, 8% of the people who didn't have the pervasive desire to die. Dr. Ganzini again, fierce independence was the reason people wanted to die, not pain. No symptom, including pain, was rated at a level of greater than 2 out of 5. Okay, and 105 people died by assisted suicide in 2014. Only 3 of them had a psychological assessment. Only 2% of the patients in the last 5 years were being referred for psychological, much less psychiatric assessments. So I talked about the Canadian Medical Association Journal. They showed in Belgium that one in 3 of the patients that the doctors admitted, and these are the ones where they filled out the paperwork, died without explicit request. They didn't call it killing. They call it LAWR, life-ending act without explicit request. I'm not actually making that up. That's what they do call it. And they tended to be older with non-cancer diagnosis and less mentally competent. And my favorite quotation out of this is that in 8.9% of the time, the physician said the reason for not seeking consent was that it would be too stressful for the patient. Now, people on the other side of this said, "Oh, this is a terrible study for our side, so we're going to go back and look at all these deaths." So they went and looked at the deaths, and they said, "Well, you know, these deaths aren't all, some of them are just palliative sedation, and some of them are just good pain control, and all of these sorts of things." So it really wasn't that high a percentage. And I say hogwash to that. If the doctors thought they were killing the patient, then it doesn't matter whether it wasn't really killing the patient. They were willing to do it. So if I give you a syringe of clear fluid and say, "Go kill this dog," and you put it in there and it turns out to just be water, that doesn't make me think that you wouldn't kill the dog. Okay, so I talked about this at the meeting the other day, that the Belgian update from this year, 4.6% of all deaths were euthanasia deaths. That's tied with the 4th leading cause of death in Canada, if we get 4.6%. Only about half of the deaths are reported. Alex Schadenberg dated Jan Bernheim, who was one of the pioneers of the Belgian legislation, and he told him all these things, and Dr. Bernheim responded, "There are problems with the Belgian euthanasia law." Now, our Supreme Court said there's no problems over there. This guy's an architect of the Belgian euthanasia law, and he says there's problems. Okay, it's expanded. In the Netherlands and in Belgium, they followed the Groningen Protocol for newborns. This was brought in mainly for kids with spina bifida. Almost 10% of children in the Netherlands and Belgium who die under the age of 1 are hastened death. And in Belgium, they only talk to the parents 81% of the time. So that means that 1 in 5 of those children was euthanized without the parents ever being asked if they wanted to take the baby home and love this baby. And that's published in Acta Pediatrica in 2007. Minors, it's legal for minors in Belgium now, and in Holland, in the Netherlands, you can ask it from 12. 16 and 17-year-olds, you have to have your parents say yes. 16 and 17-year-olds don't need consent from their parents, but the parents have to be notified. And by the time you're 18, you can ask for it, and your parents don't even get to be notified. And we know the car rental companies have had this figured out for years, that you don't have your frontal lobe connections sorted out until you're 25. But somehow, so you know how what you do now is going to affect you in the future. But somehow you're allowed to choose to die. Other examples, there's these twins that were facing potential blindness, a young person with a botched sex change operations, the anorexia patient who was raped by her psychiatrist, a depressed mother you heard about, a person in prison for life, and recently a woman with severe tinnitus who had 2 teenage children, severe ringing in her ears. And a Dutch wife, we have stats, she said, I can't take care of you anymore, it's either a nursing home or euthanasia, and the doctor knew that he was being coerced, but ended his life anyway. And there's a healthy elderly couple in Belgium that the son shopped around until he finally got an unnamed hospital to euthanize his parents, and he said it was the best solution. If one of them should die, the one who would remain would be so sad and totally dependent on us. I thought that's what life was all about. People don't believe this about the twins. I just put in the reference so you can look at it. So look at these discrepancies that are already present between geriatric wards and pediatric wards. You've got, the pediatric wards, everything's the right size for the kids, and it's pretty, and there's lovely colors. You go into the geriatric wards or nursing homes, and it smells like urine, and the paint color sucks the light out of the room. We've already gone that way. And people said to me, don't be so sure you're opposed to euthanasia until you've been in a nursing home. That's you might want to use it someday yourself. That's a sad commentary on our society, that death is the solution to that. John Katz is an author that I like reading about. He writes about dogs. He's even got a book called Cats on Dogs. But he wrote a book called The New Work of Dogs. And it's quite interesting. He talks about these people who rescue dogs out of the shelters where they euthanize dogs. And this person called in and said, what about these? You seem to be a little ambivalent. And he said, so this is what he says, there's a vast subculture of transporters, screeners, fosters, and people who follow up to make sure the dogs are doing well. While I'm in awe of their heroic work, I'm also conscious of the fact that there is no equivalent national network for troubled humans. If you type dog rescue into Google, you'll get nearly 750,000 hits. If you type people rescue, you get 5 or 6. And they say things like, well, I know the dog has behavior problems, but he's earned his retirement. Where does that fit with our dementia patients? Parker Palmer, someone else spoke about him. Sheila Harding told me this quotation, and I thought it was fantastic. Violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. Okay, this is a sign used to be out at UBC that is lit up at night, and all it has on it is a little thing that says, you are here, and the rest of it's totally blank. So, okay, where do we go from here? I think we feel like the guys in Mark 2, that they didn't know what to do with their friend, so they ripped the roof off and they put him at the feet of Jesus and they said, you deal with this, which he did. And I think that's one of the ways that we can watch with him, is to bring people to the feet of Jesus. And we talked about Harvey Chachanoff and the dignity questions. Ira Byock has a great book about dying well, the developmental stages of dying. He was challenging us in Montreal in the fall to imagine our patients well, and that people can be healed even when they're not cured. And this quotation by Cicely Saunders is really important. You matter because you are you, and you matter to the very end of your life. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die. And her call to care for those who were dying came from 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7, where God said to her, what do you have that you did not receive? And then Balmount says, our patients need to experience that we are with them as fellow travelers on this voyage. We must keep in mind that at best, we are wounded healers. And Don Quixote said, it is still some comfort in misfortune to find one who can feel for it, just to have someone there. So a caregiving conference I spoke at a couple of years said 90% of caring is just showing up. Everybody can learn to care. Okay, and now I will show you the most excellent way. Who knows where that is? Not 1 Corinthians 13. Where is it? The last verse of 12. Arnie Voth, again, gold star. Because the way that our society is going is about rights, but the most excellent way is love. Ian Benson once said, rights are an admission that love has failed. If each one of us looked out for the best interests of all the others, we wouldn't need rights. Rights are an admission that love has failed. So, Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And so we do need rights because that's the way it goes. But we need to understand that love has failed. Love has failed if we need to fall back on our rights. I also, that we can be prophetic in our culture in how we care for people. Dr. Sheila Cassidy, I think, is still alive. She was a palliative care physician in Plymouth, England, and she wrote about that when Mary broke the alabaster jar and anointed Jesus' feet and wiped it with her hair in John 12, Mary, Martha's sister, that this was a prophetic statement of an extravagance of caring that you couldn't ignore because of the aroma. And that's what Dr. Cassidy says, that if we do this with our patients, if we do that, we are affirming the worth of these people in a world where the individual is at risk of being submerged. And she said, it's a prophetic statement about the unique value of the human person, irrespective of age, social class, or productivity. It is an affirmation that people matter just because they are people, just because God made them and loves them just the way they are, not because they are good or witty or physically beautiful. So I'm going to whip through some of these things, but just about what the Christian context is, I think I'm preaching to the choir with that, so I will go quickly through that. But I have been astonished at how some of my friends this one friend who has been a worship leader, and we've known him since medical school. He came into our house and said, I heard you on the radio, and I said, well, it's pretty hard to miss me. And he said, I'm just really not sure what to think about this. And usually I'm pretty low-key about things. And I looked at him and I said, seriously? You don't know? I was completely baffled that he had not figured. I said, do not kill is pretty basic. How do you not get this? And so I think we need to get to our churches. If all you do is talk to the person sitting next to you. We have all these resources we've talked to you about this morning, throughout the conference. If you don't feel comfortable to just take those resources on your own, call me. I will talk you through it. Larry will talk you through it. Michelle Korvemacher will talk you through it. Diane Hawk will talk you through it. Dan Riley will talk you through it. We've got a whole team of people that will hold your hand and get you through it, because we need to tell our people. In Washington State, the Christians and the Catholics voted in favor of the law that's there for assisted suicide because they didn't know any better. God's in control. We're not our own. We're created in God's image, and we deface his image when we do that. We don't live completely independently. Ladies and gentlemen, independence is not a Christian virtue. Interdependence is a Christian virtue, and we need to model that. We need to bear one another's burdens. The person of God is a community in and of himself. Okay, we need to have creativity and imagination to help us concentrate on care and not killing. Caring for each other is a fundamental part of our Canadian identity as well as our Christian identity. So these concepts of home and Emmanuel are so important. People are hungry for these. One of the things that we sang in our song, Come As You Are, was, oh, wanderer, come home. You're not too far. People want to be enfolded. They want to know that God is with us. As Stephen Lawhead says in Byzantium through a character, he says, this hanging God of yours, he knows how it is with me. So they're hungry to have that authenticated. I have these two little necklaces here. I'm not sure I can tell you that story. What? 3 minutes. I actually am almost done, believe it or not. So I won't tell you the story of the necklace. You can come and ask me. One of them came from near Corrie ten Boom's house, so think about providing that. And one of them has a little lepta, the widow's mite. So every little thing that you do for the Lord, he sees it, even if it seems so ordinary. So we need to really capture the imagination of our neighbors and our culture about the kind of world we want to have and plow up this hard ground of people's hearts and minds that's been beaten down by our culture. They're like weeping over Jerusalem, you know, where Jesus said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." That's the way our culture is. He weeps over us. He's watching in the garden. So what can you do? You can pray. You can be people of hope. We're not giving up on this. One speaker I heard one time said, "I read the book, we win." Get informed, do these things. Become familiar with one or two papers. We've got the resources at CMDS and other places. All you need to do is be a witness for the defense and introduce a little bit of doubt. Have your elevator speech memorized by heart and stay on topic. Donate funds, do all of these other things. There's lots of resources here, Alex's things, stuff from CMDA, things out of Focus magazine, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Catholic Organization for Life and Family has some amazing things on their website, Life Giving Love, CMDA in the US, Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity. If you get nothing else, get this monograph by Ryan Anderson. It's always care, never kill. How assisted suicide endangers the weak, corrupts medicine, compromises the family, and violates human dignity and equality. Ryan Anderson, heritage.org, assisted suicide, always care, never kill. You'll get it. It's right out there. It's fantastic. It's secular. You can use the arguments with anybody. The UK, Care Not Killing, Tom Koch's stuff is great. Not going to read the thing about my dad. That's my email address. So I'm sorry that you had to, needed oxygen for the depth of that and the speed of that, but there are resources in there that are just not getting out for you. So send me an email and I will send you a PDF of the slides. Let me just pray for you quickly. Father God, we thank you that you do call us to watch with you in the garden, and that you don't call us to be lonely or confused there, but you are right there with us. You are our Abba. You are holding us, you hold us up, and you watch with us. Thank you for the opportunity to do the watching with our brothers and sisters. And we ask you to empower us and to give us the courage to do the things that you call us to do. In Jesus' name, amen.